Well, hello and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm John Zipper, the Vice President of Media and Editorial at the club. And today we'll be previewing a year in San Francisco politics, taking stock of Mayor Daniel Lurie's first year. And we're doing this with some of the city's leading political reporters. A few reminders before we get started. First, today's program is being recorded, so we kindly ask that you silence your cell phone for the duration of our program. We also have some question cards throughout the room. Feel free to write stuff down, and later in the program, we'll get to your questions. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about our panelists. On the middle, well, why don't I go in order here? On the far end is Annie Goss. She's formerly of the San Francisco Standard. She's now editor-at-large of the new California Post, a new sister publication of the New York Post. Next to her is Marisa Lagos, correspondent for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk and co-host of the weekly show and podcast, Political Breakdown. And next to me is Joe Eskenazi, the managing editor and a columnist at Mission Local. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Now, let's start, I guess, on the highest level, if you will, politically, and that is the mayor. Mayor Daniel Lurie completed his first year and has been getting fairly good reviews, though you can also kind of figure, okay, year two is when things get spicy. Marisa, let's start with you. What, if anything, has surprised you about Mayor Lurie's first year?
I've been surprised that he has been successful in keeping his focus on San Francisco and not being drawn into the bigger fights. I really thought that roast would be cooked by now, quite frankly. So I think, to your point, this is going to be a challenging year ahead. I think, just the level of his continually high approval ratings. I think, he's benefited in part by luck, as we often see with new executives, where some of the things that were sort of set in place before he got here have come to fruition in terms of San Francisco starting to bounce back. But I think, the fact that he's been able to really stay in his lane as a cheerleader for the city and not getting sucked into the Trump fights and successfully, it seems like, at least temporarily, stopping huge ICE immigration rates from coming here. I did not necessarily have that on my bingo card a year ago.
Annie, what's your reaction?
Yeah, I guess his sustained popularity. I don't think it's very uncommon for mayors to be popular, in their first year in office. But, he did have some challenges when he took office. We had a very difficult budget cycle, for one. He managed to kind of get through that without too many slings and arrows. Of course, there's always criticism in a time of budget cuts, but he was able to navigate that without a tremendous lasting political damage. And as Marisa noted, navigating the situation with ICE and the National Guard and Trump, and I know we wish we all had more information on what exactly went down there, but that was a feather in his cap as well. So those were the things that jumped out at me.
Yeah, maybe we'll get into that a bit more. Joe, your initial take?
Well, I guess I'm not surprised, but I am a little bit startled by the divergence between the lack of tangible accomplishments and the ongoing high popularity rate, especially when many of the things that are a mayor's duty are not well ranked by people in polls, but people still love Daniel Lurie. And there's an amazing amount of mileage that you can get and are still getting by being a nice, genuine, honest, heartfelt guy. And he really is that guy. Even off camera, Daniel Lurie is a good and decent person, and I think people were ready for that. I think people underestimated just how much the city was done with Mayor London Breed. I think a lot of the things that are most endearing about Mayor Lurie probably people would not be as generous with Mayor Breed. I think if Mayor Breed was on Instagram all the time, people would say, "Get back to work, lady." Mm-hmm. And you can, there are societal reasons for that, and we can, delve into that if we want.
But also tonal reasons, right? That's another surprise, I think, is he actually seems to have taken down the temperature at City Hall a little bit.
Well, he's got a pliant board and they were, they're all with him. And there's not an Aaron Peskin or a Dean Preston or a Hillary Ronen who's lobbing things his way. There's Jackie Fielder, and that is not the same. And so we'll just see what happens in the second year. A lot of the tangible accomplishments are yet to be done. Something we wrote about at Mission Local is we asked the mayor's office for a list of tangible accomplishments, and they were all good things, but I was taken aback that it was not the New Deal. It was not the Norman Conquest. It was opening up the facility at 822 Geary, which is an odd thing to put a flag in because that was bought under Mayor Breed. That was planned under Mayor Breed. All the homeless beds, the majority of them that we got were in the pipeline under Mayor Breed. So, People are just happier now, and there's not a constant doom loop narrative coming to us from the national press and the local press. And kudos to Mayor Lurie for not buying into that. He was rewarded. The mayoral candidates who bought into that are gone.
Yeah, I mean,
What a change from Gavin Newsom's 3-binder ring full matrix of accomplishment. Throw that in there for those who remember Mayor Newsom.
yeah, I would just note that, from the perspective of the economy, a lot of the sort of doom loop metrics, real estate demand, tourism, those things had already really bottomed out during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic years when London Breed was mayor, and we're already on the upswing. So I think to a great extent, the mayor has benefited from these natural tailwinds that he really has nothing to do with, that he's very lucky to be in office at a time when those things are kind of naturally on the upswing. But he's been very successful in kind of taking credit for those things, changing leadership within city government to kind of give the impression that that he's responsible for the positive momentum.
Joe, you recently did an overview of the mayor's record and uncovered a staggering level of caffeine intake. What was that about?
Well, he's on Instagram a lot, and I am not, but the mayor is going to go to various businesses and, is going to have a cup of coffee. And, my non-journalist, non-political friends and colleagues will just reach out and say, I'm concerned about Mayor Lurie's caffeine intake. And, I'd heard that he is not finishing each cup of coffee because, thank God, otherwise, let's put it this way. After today's State of the City address, he's going to be, and this is when the onion is not necessary. He actually said on the mayor's daily schedule, he'll be cutting the ribbon at the Taco Bell Cantina at Fisherman's Wharf. And it's like, is he going to drink coffee at Taco Bell? Because I don't think that's a good idea.
No, but they do have frozen margaritas if it's anything like the Pacifica ones. So,
yeah.
We can have some fun.
I would say drinking coffee and eating Taco Bell is a dangerous prospect, and
I'm just going to say there was excitement in my house about the new cantina, but...
certainly, and more so when your kids are 21. But it's also, imagine the worst tourist scene ever is the Taco Bell.
Well, yeah, that's what I said. I was like, we'll go to Pacifica. It's closer to our house.
Yeah, for sure.
That's-
So in any event, he will be there. It will be on Instagram. There will probably not be coffee doffed at the Taco Bell Cantina, but you will be seeing this on Instagram. And I think, getting back to our first discussion of the day, people like this. I mean, cynical journalistic types might say, are you going to go to every cafe in the city? But people seem to like it. It's positive. It's upbeat. The businesses that are featured say that they're getting a bounce. So, at some point, this reassuring fireside chat of the 21st century is working for people.
And you do have to give him credit, because to your point about who he is, that actually comes across in his Instagram. One of my favorites was him in his full suit and tie talking about how excited he was for the Grateful Dead. It was so incongruous, but it worked because, it's weirder if a politician suddenly shows up in a T-shirt and tries to act like a normal person.
It was very odd when Gavin Newsom would quote from the Grateful Dead.
It was also a city story when he showed up once without hair gel and everybody was wondering where he slept the night before. But I digress. No, I think Lurie has done a good job of staying authentic and also sort of hitting these different little niche pockets of culture and, to your point, businesses and. Yeah, but again, I think the rubber hits the road when you're not just cheerleading, you're actually having to solve problems.
Well, I want to get into one hurdle he ran into, which was the sunset supervisor. But before I do that, maybe each of you starting just come down the line, care to estimate or guess when the honeymoon might end?
Gosh, I'm not in the prediction business, but
Or
maybe by
what you think might cause it to end?
Continued encroachment by the federal government that forces him to address that more head-on, and or a budget cycle that requires him to piss off key constituencies.
Okay, Marisa?
Yeah, I feel like it's possible he gets an even longer runway because there's going to be other local things like the race to replace Nancy Pelosi that kind of suck the political attention away from him in a way that I think he will embrace. But I do think that those types of contests and a lot of the tax fights we're going to see play out both statewide and in San Francisco, like, are going to force him to have to like pick a team in some places, and that's going to be kind of fascinating to watch. But I actually don't predict that like he's going to crash and burn this year in any way. I think that general public sentiment, unless something like extraordinary happens here, and even if it did, I mean, I think what you're probably going to see in Minneapolis is like more support for the mayor there after what's happening. So, you know, I think those are going to be tests for Lurie, but I wouldn't like necessarily predict that he's going to fail miserably in all of them.
Yeah, I guess there's, you know, those things and other things that could happen, like the AI industry goes bust, kind of punctures the positive narrative, the narrative that he's
Also
kind
the
of
city budget.
Exactly. You know, so then, you know, when there are real problems happening, you know, being on Instagram talking about like your favorite bubble tea shop is going to look tone deaf.
Yeah, I will say I walked through Union Square on the way here, and it was lovely. There was sun shining. They had classical musicians playing this week. And then, yeah, you walk another block, and like every store is boarded up. So, Tale of Two Cities, as always.
Okay.
I think San Francisco voters became radicalized to an extent when people who never before relied upon government suddenly had to rely upon government, and that specifically is your child is at home, unable to go to school, and you can't earn a living. And I think that public school teachers going on strike could definitely hit people hard.
Fair.
And so when suddenly the government isn't working and now it's affecting you, people get angry and they recall school board members and they vote in an angry way. And so, like, if you are a poor person or a person who, you know, depended upon the good graces of the Human Services Agency, like, you're used to getting inefficient government and, you know, bad service. Most of us are lucky enough not to need government to function in order for us to live our daily lives. You get angry when the bus doesn't come. You get angry when you drive into a pothole large enough to be a two-bedroom apartment. But like, you know, you move on. When your kid's home from school and you can't earn a living, that's a big deal. So we'll see what happens with stuff like that.
I think that's a really good point. That and if this is like longer term, but if Muni can't get the money it needs, like those are real things people rely on.
Okay. Joe, let's dig a little bit more into what happened in the Sunset, where Mayor Lurie's first supervisor appointment had to withdraw amid a scandal over how she operated her small business. Mission Local broke some big stories on this. Remind us what happened.
Well, there's a lot, you know. It was a concatenation of missteps that really kind of pulled the curtain away from this administration, because they're really good at keeping secrets to themselves. They're really good at letting the information that they want out and not letting the information out that they don't want. However, this was such a fantastic set of missteps in appointing a supervisor replacement for Joel Engardio that it really makes you question everything. In a nutshell, we were all told that it would be a 29-year-old woman that no one had ever heard of named Bea Alcaraz, who her only accomplishment, you know, in public life was being the owner of a pet shop in the Sunset. And, you know, being a lifelong Sunset resident who, you know, went to Catholic school there and didn't graduate from college, you know, and you know, wasn't a lawyer, didn't have a legislative history, never went to a government meeting, didn't know the difference between a motion, a resolution, and an ordinance. So that on its face was not great. Then the Standard broke the story that the pet shop that she operated there were allegations of appalling conditions. You know, inhumane conditions, dead animals, you know, rodent infestations. It's a bit on the nose, but, you know, she had dead animals in the freezer, and that means that the mayor's office failed to vet someone who literally had skeletons in the closet. The coup de grace was when Mission Local reported that she had texted the successor owner of the pet shop about how she paid workers under the table, and therefore her tax burden was lower, and she also used her work credit card to take people out on the town, which is tantamount to admitting to tax fraud. So that was a quick resignation after 8 days, which you can look up. That makes her the Lady Jane Grey of San Francisco politics. Then there was a pivot from this very private, you know, clandestine naming someone you've never heard of to a very public, almost competition for the supervisor job that was like, who wants to be a District 4 supervisor, in which the vetting seems to have been like overtly left to the media. I know that Mission Local knocked 2 of the candidates out. One of them forgot to file taxes for his nonprofit, and the other one never voted in 9 years and was a registered Republican.
Save them some money, you know.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's not great. Just because you have a safety net under the trapeze doesn't mean you should try to fall. You know, I mean, like the vetting is serious. They also came up with a questionnaire that asked more in-depth questions than we ask of the mayor himself. It asked about offshore bank accounts, but it didn't ask, do you vote? Which is an interesting way of doing things. In the end, the job went to Alan Wong, who has the job now, and hasn't exactly hit the ground running, which is hard in the sand, but still. So that was just a series of missteps. You know, the analogy we like to use, or I like to use at Mission Local, is if you're old enough, you remember the Sesame Street baker who always announced what he was going to cook and then fell down the stairs reliably. And that was really a series of falling down the stairs out there in District 4.
Annie, how did this happen? Was this? I
Yeah.
mean, Lurie is new to to City Hall, but he's got some seasoned pros with him.
Exactly. And I think what was most shocking to me about this, and I wasn't even covering this, I was on maternity leave, but I was, you know, like every journalist in town, getting a flurry of texts about this. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with being young and, you know, getting an appointment. There's nothing wrong with being a non-lawyer or non-experienced politician and finding yourself in one of these positions. But the fact that, you know, every journalist in town was receiving information about her background, and we all had access to that information. The mayor's office purportedly had a private firm to vet her. And the mayor, by the way, has the resources to pay for this sort of thing. He could certainly hire a PI firm or whatever you do for, you know, just sort of vet political candidates. How we would all know about these things from her history and how they would not discover them, although they said they hired a private firm, was just incredibly weird to me. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. How does this happen? You know, one interpretation, and this is just my speculation, could be that the mayor was, you know, a political novice, and he maybe is naturally sort of sympathetic to that you know, somebody who comes into the job with no political experience and thought, oh, great, she's from the neighborhood, she's from the community, like, what could be better? But what I remain confused by is how they would miss all of those things, despite all the staff and the resources at hand to avoid those kind of missteps.
I mean, it's understandable why she would have been really an attractive candidate. Like, they needed a unicorn, right? They needed someone who was like gonna support his zoning plan, but not maybe too much. Who would, you know, oppose Sunset Dunes, but maybe not try to make that their entire, you know, personality, who could sort of speak across cultural and political lines in, let's face it, like a place that had become really politicized in a way that like it wasn't a few years ago. And so, I mean, I think that's probably what, like, again, none of us know.
There's a
but,
lot
like,
of things that happened here.
but like she walked up to him right at an event and was just like,
Yeah.
hey, make me supervisor.
Yeah, and that's just
So
a
they
weird
say. I mean,
story.
in this case, if you had Mayor Aaron Peskin or Mayor London Breed or Mayor Mark Farrell, they would know people in the Sunset, and they would be able to get a roster of candidates. That didn't happen here.
Yeah.
And then on top of everything else, you know, you could call up the people at the business there. You could look up, you know,
Well, that's the thing.
violations
They
at the
didn't
business.
vet
You don't have to
her
leave your
at
chair to
all.
do that, right?
Like,
Yeah.
you didn't, they
That-
could have
that
just
shows-
like physically gone to that business.
That shows a lack of understanding and or lack of respect for what the legislative body does.
Yeah.
It's an insult to all the supervisors, and I can tell you that is how it was taken by the supervisors. So you know, you can't just plink in, you know, Justice Harriet Myers, who is plenty smart, as George W. Bush said, onto the Supreme Court and have it work. In this case, you know, it would be nice to have someone who is, you know, a person of the people, but also they had trouble getting people to take the job. There were a number of people who were offered the job who said no or preemptively took themselves out of the running because the conditions put on are very difficult. If you're going to get up there and say, I support upzoning in the Sunset, you know, you lose. You will lose. You know, you're taking on a very difficult spot here with the most radicalized voting population in San Francisco right now. So that is quite a maneuver to have to do, to say I'm in support of upzoning in the Sunset, and you know I want to make loud noises about Sunset Dunes but not do anything.
But not actually.
Yeah.
Well, right. And I just think, like, regardless of what the mayor's personal kind of feelings were about her or a candidate, you have an entire staff and political staff.
You could just call up the office there.
It's-
You just say, you don't have to say we're making her a supervisor. You could say,
I mean, I know they
"We're
did
gonna give
Oppo
her a
research
job."
on the other candidates during the campaign, so they clearly have an Oppo research person. That's what you do. You Oppo research your own people. That is like standard political practice. So yeah, it was a big miss.
It is unfortunate this happened because you know, she should not have put herself forward for a job she was patently unqualified to do. But on the other hand, she was publicly humiliated, and it did did not have to
Yeah,
happen.
it was
This should not have
Yeah.
happened.
It's really sad.
Yeah, the mayor afterwards said, I will. He said, I will grow. I will do better. It's like, I'm not worried about you, dude.
Right.
Like
What
you'll be
happens
fine.
to her?
Yeah. This was a young woman who was publicly humiliated, and it didn't have to happen.
Alan Wong, as was mentioned, did then get appointed. What's his initial month or so been? I mean, we saw just this week he failed to get the other supervisors to agree to put forth another ballot measure to revisit the Great Highway closing. Marisa?
Well, I was just saying, if you haven't read it, the Mission Local account of how this played out is worth reading and could be like a humorous short story. Yeah, I mean, according to all the reporting, like he did not really do much to try to actually get the 4 supervisors he needed to get this on the ballot in June. I do wonder, look, he had to come in, obviously he supported the reversal of the park and the closure, but like, it raises questions for me about how much he really wanted to see this on the ballot, or was it just like sort of being green and being a politician? But I mean, we were talking about this before, like a lot of what Mission Local reported was this idea that he didn't actually go to his colleagues on the board and like in person or even in phone calls appeal to them to support what he wanted to do. And to me, that doesn't just speak to like being new at politics. Like that's how you operate in the world, right? In any business. Like you don't just like send out emails as a reporter or as a person in a business setting and assume that like that's going to be enough to get buy-in from other people.
Not unless you want to say I sent an email.
Exactly. So that to me is the biggest question. Like, did he kind of want this to not be on the ballot because it would have just caused a huge headache? It was pretty doomed to fail. I would argue that the politics, even since the last vote, have gotten tougher for the West Side to defeat this. I think a lot of people throughout the city either have been kind of turned off by a lot of what they've seen in terms of the local politics, the recall, and then, I'm a parent. My kid goes to Aptos Middle School. He and all his friends who go to there and APG and INNI are going to the skate park all the time now. So taking something away from people that they've been given is much more difficult than never giving it to them. And I just think that it was politically a tough one for proponents of reopening.
Yeah, I mean, it did. I also really enjoyed the Mission Local story about this, and it did make me wonder if he really cared about getting it on the ballot, or he really just wanted to seem like
the credit,
he cared
yeah.
about getting it on the ballot. I think anyone in this supervisor seat was going to have a tough job over the next few months, just navigating all the anger, the continuing anger over the Great Highway, the upzoning. I can understand why there weren't a ton of people necessarily raising their hands for this job, but yeah, it does seem like he's maybe a bit green based on.
Yeah,
based
it's
on
like
the
now what
Mission
happens
Local
when he
piece.
actually has legislation.
But he
Exactly.
shouldn't be. Alan Wong is a former legislative aide, and,
And he has a
he's elected
great
member of
CV,
government.
yeah.
Yeah. So he's elected. So you can't come and say you don't know which way it is to the restroom or how to do legislation. And Marisa hit the nail on the head on this one, which is this is just basic human interactions. If you really care to convince people, you go and talk to them in person. You show up at their house. You might even offer some kind of deal, right? What can I do for you in order to vote for this for me? It would have absolutely benefited Alan Wong to have this on the ballot in June, because guess what else is on the ballot in June? Alan Wong.
Yeah.
So an independent election committee could have put pictures of Alan Wong with a baseball bat taking down that park or whatever, and people would have gone and voted for him, right?
Again, I don't know.
So then it becomes
that could have backfired. But yeah.
this was among the most inept attempts to put something on the ballot that I can ever remember. And I've asked people with longer memories than me, and they can't remember it either because, again, like with Bea Alcaraz, this should have been done behind closed doors instead of the cope that he's got afterwards is that it's political sabotage. That's astounding.
Could you explain that? Who he's accusing of why?
He's accusing Shaman Walton of political sabotage because he didn't sign on to this because Shaman Walton's legislative aide, Natalie G., is also on the ballot in June. Well, first of all, this is not like some kind of surprise pro wrestling move. She's been on the ballot for a while. She's been his leg aide for a while. You knew this. And so you knew that you had to go through this path if you chose to. So putting your head down and running into a wall, who put that wall there? It was odd, and also like, I tried and I failed this is government,
Well, he also, as you
don't-
guys, I think, definitely pointed out, was like, well, it's not that complicated of a measure. You're like, well, it sort of is.
It
'Cause
is. He
Now
made-
you
he
have
made
to
it
put the
very
toothpaste
complicated.
back in the tube. Yeah, I mean, all the.
Well, so in addition to the fact of like, he said, I just want to go back to how things were before it was Sunset Dune Park, where it was like it'll be a highway during the weekdays and a park during the weekends. But then he put in this weird notion that in extraordinary circumstances during the weekends, the Brecken Park director can make the call unilaterally to put cars on the Great Highway. And it's like,
What?
are you going to usher me and my family off? And there's all these crying children with their little push bikes, because
Do we even
people
have a
need to
Brecken
drive.
Park director?
We don't. We
Yeah.
have Phil Ginsburg still. And there's
Oh, he didn't leave?
a series. He's not yet. There's a series of public meetings in which people have to like make input into what they want in a Brecken Park director, which is something nobody's ever thought of. So that is odd. But this was just a really terrible attempt at legislation, and then like a really terrible attempt at CYA, in which clearly his colleagues said, you didn't reach out to us enough, didn't give us enough time, didn't talk to us, didn't come to us in person. And he said, I think I did enough. It's, well, the results speak for themselves.
Okay, but winners here, I do think, include to some extent the mayor, at least short term, because he gets to wash his hands of this whole thing. Connie Chan, the supervisor from the Richmond, who's running for Pelosi's seat, who signed on, and so gets to sort of have her cake and eat it too. And my supervisor in D11, Cheyenne Chen, who signed on like 20 minutes before the deadline when it was very clear there was not going to be a fourth signature. Like, I think they both get to go back to their constituents and say, hey, we tried, he messed it up, sorry.
And
know?
to Maurice's point, like at this point also, we wouldn't just be voting on this because of opening or closing a park. Having a bunch of aggrieved single issue and Chinese voters in the West Side run out to vote and then seeing Connie Chan on the ballot running for Congress would also be something that propels people to put this onto the ballot. However, since this possibility arose last year, the labor forces backing Connie Chan have said, don't do that,
Right.
because then you're going to send a bunch of conservative voters out to vote against our CEO tax in June. So that's not happening now. However, if they signature gather a mere 10,000 and change votes across the entire city, we could be voting on this in November when odds are Connie will be on the ballot again. So she could get an absolute double dip out of this.
Does
We
this,
could make one of those like psycho maps of like how these like overlapping
between them.
interests with the strings and the
does it bode ill then, do you think, for Alan Wong and
It doesn't
June?
bode well. It doesn't bode well.
It would be hard to turn that into a winning slogan.
I mean, let's put it this way, right? Like, he's trying now to say, like, I tried hard, and he's hoping that people who are really upset about the way things are at Sunset Dunes Park are going to say, well, he tried, and, evil Shaman Walton stepped in his way by employing Natalie G 8 years ago, or whatever it was. I mean, there's a Big Lebowski line for everything, and this one is just because we're bereaved doesn't make us saps. I don't think that people are going to buy into that. I think people saw it as a bad attempt.
Any thoughts otherwise?
I don't really know.
No? Okay. Well, let's talk about the family zoning plan. I would guess that just pretty much everyone in the room has strong feelings one way or the other about it. One of the mayor's the big victories was the passage of this so-called family zoning plan. It remains hotly controversial in some areas. So first, Marisa, can I turn to you to explain what it is and what Lurie is trying to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, broad brushstrokes, this would make it way easier to build denser housing on major transit corridors, not just, south of Market, downtown, east sides, where we've seen a lot of redevelopment in the past decades, but throughout the city. And so that's why we saw, for example, in the Richmond and Sunset, a lot of pushback, this idea that if you're building up, Geary and Taraval, I mean, there's a number of different arguments, right? I think some people don't want to see more dense housing, period. They don't want to see the neighborhoods change. There's been concern from small businesses that this could result in buildings essentially being, bought, demolished, rebuilt as housing, and essentially kick them out of their long-standing business spots. This is part of a bigger debate we're having in California, one which I gotta say, I am continually shocked by how fast the tide shifted around this. I mean, if you think about all the stuff that Assemblymember Buffy Wicks and Senator Scott Wiener have done in Sacramento, along with other colleagues, to push these sort of types of zoning changes statewide to really force cities and counties to develop. Even CEQA reform, which I know has not like been wholesale, but is something, this is the Environmental Quality Act. It's been used here in San Francisco and statewide for decades. Critics would say to just slow down construction, even if it has nothing to do with environmental concerns. We did see some pretty significant reforms to that last year. I think it's pretty wild. Like 10 years ago, if you had told me that like Democrats from the Bay Area would be pushing CEQA reform and that a very popular mayor would be pushing upzoning on the west side, I would have told you were crazy. So I think that this really speaks to like some generational changes too. I think for folks in my age group, like under the age of 50, there's been a real sense, and not among everybody, but that like one of the things standing in our way to buying houses and like sort of staying in the places that we either grew up or chose to live in after college is out of reach. And there's been a lot of cases made that part of that is around housing production. So I think it's funny because it's one of those issues that is both like giant and very myopic in the sense that like people in theory might support housing production, but when it's next door to them have very different feelings. And I find it just so fascinating the way that this has scrambled the sort of political allyships. Like you talk about Connie Chan and the labor unions, and I think we always have to be careful when we talk about labor, especially in San Francisco, to say there are like different types of labor unions, right? There are like public employee unions like SEIU that tend to be very progressive, and then you have like the building trades and others that have historically lined up more with business interest because that's where their bread and butter comes from. But I think like what you see with something like Wiener and this Pelosi race against someone like Connie Chan, and then obviously Trekat Chakrabarty, who's coming from the sort of like AOC progressive national vein, is that like, I don't know what this will do entirely to their core constituencies. Like you do have a lot of sort of younger people who support Scott Wiener with the abundance mindset. And then you have older folks who may not like Connie Chan's more progressive positions on some things, but love what she's doing around housing. So I think, it was a big win for Lurie. We're not going to actually see the effects of this for several years. As we all know, development takes a long time, but it's certainly set off a lot of like shifting kind of political fights, and I think it's going to be fascinating to watch.
We'll get more into the Pelosi race in a little bit, but
sorry to jump ahead. But.
no, it's okay. I think everyone's aware of it. Annie, opponents are suing over this family zoning plan, and it may face a ballot measure at some point to block it. What are its prospects, or what's the staying power, do you think, in the fight on this?
Well, I mean, stepping back a little bit, the family zoning plan is something that was always going to happen in some form or fashion because it's the reason it's happening is because there's a state mandate that requires the city to do this and to change its zoning rules to accommodate a certain amount of new housing over the next, I believe it's an 8-year cycle.
82,000.
So this has been kind of long in the works and was mostly done, to my understanding, under Mayor London Breed, and then Daniel Lurie closed it out, stamped a family-friendly branding on it by calling it the family zoning plan.
Which we don't use. I just call it the
Yeah.
Minnesota
Yeah.
Zoning.
Well, I also don't call it the big beautiful bill. I object to all weird,
Me too. And I was like, guys, we're not calling it that. But so anyway, so this has been kind of a long time in the works. And it was always going to happen in some form because there are penalties that could happen if we didn't take this sort of action. But
penalties being basically the state being like, that Safeway building they're proposing in the marina can go in anywhere. I mean,
exactly.
Right?
I mean, in the worst case scenario, there's something called the builder's remedy, which basically invalidates all local building restrictions, and you can build whatever you want if the city is found to be out of compliance with certain state housing laws. So, but also, as Marisa noted, it's kind of intangible right now. It's one of those things where people are like, sure, more housing sounds great, but it will take many years for the environment to change in a meaningful way, or a more visible way as a result of these zoning changes. And then you have things like the Marina Safeway plan to kind of become this political litmus test
Must be in
for
January's nightmares.
right,
Like
which
those
yeah,
renderings,
right, which is kind of like the modern day Fontana Towers.
It's much bigger than Fontana Towers.
Which is it's actually bigger than Fontana Towers, and there's still like angst in that part of the city over the Fontana Towers, which are those big like gap tooth buildings that block the waterfront. So now we have this convenient political litmus test that I'm sure lots of people will be asked about in the congressional race and in other areas. I think even like Tom Steyer has weighed in on it. That demonstrates to the public how they feel about just overall these zoning changes that will eventually, change our environment pretty dramatically, like over the course of decades.
Well, if anybody has any questions about where every elected or aspiring elected official of note stands on the Marina Safeway, we asked, and we got answers from them all, and we
Right.
made a chart out of it, and you can look it up. And it Junya Yang, who's really brilliant, and made a great chart for us, and so we have them all on the record.
Some of them surprised me.
Yes, a couple of them did surprise me, and the only one who refused to talk about it was Matt Haney, which was odd. So we had to come up with
He
a separate
talks about
color for
everything.
him.
Who surprised you?
I would say
I mean, I guess that anyone supported it. Like
Gary McCoy was out and out for it. Who else? Jackie Fielder, Cheyenne Chen. It wasn't a neat breakdown like you'd expect, and some of them had very long, eloquent answers, and others, just said yes, yes,
Bilal
no.
Mahmood. Didn't he support it?
He did.
That was the surprise to me. That
He
surprised
did,
me.
but he also brought up the one in the Fillmore, which actually would be even bigger and is much more problematic because redevelopment of the Fillmore is a bigger deal. The reason we have a family zoning plan, or at least the strategy that goes into it, was to offer an attractive alternative so people don't build things like the Safeway. You want to make your local plan attractive enough that a developer might choose it instead of the state plan, which isn't close in the Safeway site. You can get a lot more with the state plan. By offering attractive alternatives, you might get people to buy in and put money into the local measures that you want, the local affordable housing, as opposed to using the state plan, and they can just do whatever they want, and they don't have to have any kind of offsets that help the city. So it's almost like, imagine like a used car dealer. It's like, you could go to this. And so you want to have this attractive alternative. There's a lot of gamesmanship there. In order to make the numbers mandated by the state, you can upzone pretty heavily along these transit corridors where there already are relatively large buildings.
Right.
So it's not realistic to think that they're going to knock down 6- and 8-story buildings to build more, and that people are going to be put through hell when there are pretty strong existing rules regarding putting rent-controlled tenants out and demolishing, perfectly good housing. That's probably not going to happen. So that, to me, is just making potential numbers in order to game the system, right? We need to create the potential for this many units so you can build really tall here where you absolutely won't do it. And they left much of the West Side alone where there certainly is potential. And for people who live in neighborhoods like Marisa and myself, if they said you could sell your property to some developer and he could build tall there, it's like that puts the power on me. Like my neighbors might not be thrilled, but that gives me the power, right? So they didn't do that just because of neighborhood rancor. The notion of building tall along Taraval, let's say, and then going in. They didn't think to do that at all. The impact of the zoning plan remains to be seen. According to Ted Egan, the city economist, it will be very limited. He predicted at most 14,600 additional units over the next 20 years. That's not a whole hell of a lot. He predicted that at best it would knock $125 off your monthly rent bill, which is, you could buy a few cases of beer for that. But, if you're paying $3,000 a month, it's not revelatory. It doesn't really suddenly make it affordable.
Right.
So, and, I'm not against this, habitually, but the notion of family zoning plan is a bit cynical for a plan that lets you jam as many units as you can into a building so that you can make rabbit warrens. That's not how families live. So we'll see what comes of it. It was mandated by the state. And, it had to be done, and now it's done.
Right.
Well, and so what is the total that we need to do to reach to get to the state mandated level. Isn't something like 82,000 units?
I don't think they, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, they don't penalize you for not reaching it because the city
you have
can't.
to try.
You have to create the potential.
Oh,
for it.
Right.
so like Alan Wong, they just have to send out emails saying that they want to.
Well, I think
but
it's in recognition that housing production is also tied to macroeconomic things that like are out of our control.
Right.
You know,
So, yeah, this is where you get like the rubber meets the road. Like it's not a mandate for the city to build it. It's a mandate for the city to get out of the way so the private sector can, which nobody can force the private sector to do. Which is, one of the critiques I would say you hear from the left writ large about a lot of these zoning changes in the state, which is like, we are not, this is not going to happen just because zoning was changed. Like there are market forces, obviously interest rates matter. But I do think like stepping back, California and San Francisco in particular has had a very bad reputation around the ability to build anything. And I do think that that is changing in itself. And that is not like a concrete thing that's going to build 1,000 homes tomorrow, but I think long term it likely will have some effect.
So San Francisco, true or false, you think, will not meet its mandated state numbers?
Nobody does.
I mean, the numbers aren't realistic.
Yeah. I mean,
Like building 82,000 homes in the next, how many years? It would be,
Yeah,
it would be
2031, I think.
many multiples of the greatest production we've ever had ever.
Right.
Maybe even the post-war era.
but, as somebody who sat through hours-long debates over whether like a building on 16th Street should be able to build like 2 more units, I think that there's, an argument that if nothing else, this could speed up some planning commission.
Yeah, just because you can't make the 82,000 doesn't mean like, well, it's all worthless. Yeah, there's good to be had here.
Well, and my point in bringing that up was you mentioned maybe 14,000 units, possibly could be done under this plan, that there still is thousands more that even if you're only just trying, you're not going to reach the 82,000, still somehow has to be done. So I guess that kind of leads to the question of, does Lurie have planned the next part of the plan or the next plan? I mean,
I heard he got a lot of billionaires' phone numbers, so I think he should maybe call them, see if they want to build some things.
okay. Well,
John's like, okay, that's not going to happen. But he is using his connections to wealth and power in multiple ways here. And it will be interesting, I think, to see if that extends to these types of projects.
well, I was going to bring that up when you mentioned earlier about the Donald Trump and the troops, and Mayor Lurie is taking credit for having changed Donald Trump's mind, but others have said
He's been discreet. He's never out and outdone that. He's kind of left it unsaid what he did and didn't say. He said that he did not. He said nothing was asked of him, but he's never really let us in on what happened during that call. And in fact, the city's Sunshine Ordinance Task Force has said that he's in violation of open government rules by not telling us. So we may have to just accept the mystery. According to Trump, he got calls from Jensen Huang and Mark Benioff.
well, and that's what I was going to
Yeah.
say. It's like people are saying that's what actually changed Donald Trump's
I mean,
mind.
there are probably fewer billionaires in Donald Trump's circle in Minneapolis, right? And so you go there, and there's a highly visible minority population that you can go after. That there isn't that in San Francisco.
Yeah. I think from what I understand, there was a lot of calls being made. Lurie was certainly one of them. I don't know if I need the transcript of that call to guess what it sounded like. We both know what Trump and Mayor Lurie sound like, and I'm not saying we shouldn't fight for it. I'm just saying like I could guess how that went, and I think Lurie probably did what he does in general, which is stay on script and like not antagonize and probably be very conciliatory and drop a lot of names of these folks who are in Trump's circle. But the governor told us that he worked on it too. I don't know like that he's in a position to call Trump and get anything he wants right now, although who knows, sometimes, Mamdani showed up and he told him he was handsome, so.
Yeah, Mamdani and Trump are apparently texting pals now.
But not only does Donald Trump have friends and donors in San Francisco, it's also the center of the AI industry, which he cares a lot about. And
Who are
so,
also his friends and donors.
Yeah, and so having troops in the streets in the city where your allies are
Yes,
making their
I think
fortunes,
that's 100%.
maybe not to his.
And as we've seen,
in his best interest.
as Minneapolis has made it very clear, the real worry is not the National Guard. The National Guard is very circumscribed in what it can do.
Thank you.
The real worry is Border Patrol and ICE, especially Border Patrol, who are the real cowboys. Those are the guys you see clips of, wandering around indiscriminately harassing people, beating people, killing people. Those are the ones that always had the city much more worried. So whatever the mayor did or didn't do, it was good.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, let's talk about, well, I want to get into Nancy Pelosi and the race to succeed her. First, I want to spend some time just talking about Pelosi and the legacy and what people are going, the shoes that people are going to try to fill. Marisa, she has been...
Like literally, I would love her shoes if she wants to give them to me.
Well, she has been one of the most powerful figures in Washington for years, but she really highlighted San Francisco in her retirement announcement. Can you talk a bit about her national image compared to her profile here at home?
Yeah, it's so stark, right? I mean, she is literally like has been at least historically. I'm sure we have some new potential folks like, Newsom and Mamdani, but I mean, if you count the number of ads Republicans ran over the past 20 years with her in them in races she had like literally nothing to do with.
On the other side of the country.
Yeah, everywhere. It's just remarkable. And I do think, Pelosi, I think, has like two sort of main things that have made her so successful. And one is absolutely her deep ties and relationships here in San Francisco, which unlike I think a lot of people who go to DC and sort of rise up the ranks, she has maintained in like really meaningful ways. I mean, you see it when she comes to events, when she does news conferences here. I think you got to give her credit, given her power and wealth, quite frankly. Like, she's stayed very close to people and the people. And just, yeah, I just think, like, her vibe when she's out in public is very different than the way we see a lot of national figures. And even after the attack on her husband and, the I'm just sure, insane amount of threats that the family gets, she's not, like, barricaded, when she's at community events. So I think that has really like given her the goodwill locally for her to do the national work. Because if constituents feel like you have their back, they're willing to let you kind of do things that aren't directly related to your district. And that gets me to what I think is sort of her second strongest point, her legacy, which is like, she is a master legislator. Like, she was not born to be an executive. She liked being largely in a lot of these fights behind the scenes. Her relationships with individual members and like understanding what they both cared about personally and needed politically allowed her to do things like her biggest legislative accomplishment, which is the Affordable Care Act, which never would have happened without her. Like, we call it Obamacare, but you could call it Pelosi care, honestly, which would be worse for Democrats. But yeah, so I think when you look at that, like, it really, and I think she's managed, props to her for like picking the right moment to go out and not overstaying. I think that has also been part of her kind of political genius in recent years. I'm sure there are people that wish she had picked a few years earlier, but I think in general, she's getting to have her flowers, and she's managed by most accounts, and I'm not in DC, but to do a pretty good job of like handing off the reins to Hakeem Jeffries, but and still like maintaining power and really helping guide him behind the scenes with, I think like that's a really hard thing to do, right? To be the emeritus speaker and to still be there and to not like be stepping on his toes or have him feel like you are sort of trying to come for him or just like pull the strings. And my sense is that she's done a good job of that. So I think that gets back to like her relationship with the 200 plus members in her caucus was always really instrumental to her ability to get legislation through. And then, and also just like her famous line, which is like, it's sort of like the original Mel Robbins, like, let them. Like, when members need to distance themselves from Pelosi, when they need to attack her in their races, her line was like, just win, baby. A little different from our last president, I would say. So, I think all of the kind of kudos that she's getting are very well deserved in that sense. And of course, there's criticisms we can talk about, but I think that that's really how she's going to leave.
Joe, how do you think she's going to be remembered and her legacy?
Oh, I think very well. I mean, even people who are very far to the left and rant and rave would probably have to admit that she's incredibly effective. And if nothing else, I would say too effective sometimes, because she brings back money here for projects that we shouldn't have built. I think that like Nancy's ability to keep things funded and keep things working outstripped San Francisco's ability to handle it. If you look at the Central Subway, like terrible idea, terrible execution, fully funded. So that will happen. Whoever comes next will not have those connections, will not be able to keep San Francisco fed that way. A quote I had in the story from Aaron Peskin was, "I have no idea how it worked. The money just kept showing up." Right? So now we're going to have to learn to not expect what we've become accustomed to, which is all that money coming our way. I wish we'd spent it better when we had it. That wasn't her prerogative. That wasn't her department.
And is it fair to say that regardless of who replaces her, and we'll get into that in a moment, no one, I shouldn't even say replace, whoever succeeds her, there is no next Pelosi.
No.
San Francisco loses influence.
I would agree with that. And, I think a couple of things that haven't already been mentioned are that, one, she's genuinely a trailblazer for, women my age and, a different generation kind of take this for granted. But her becoming the first female Speaker of the House was a huge deal. Yeah. and doing
and
that
always
job,
embracing her being a mother, and
Right.
she never tried to leave that part behind, which I
Yeah.
think was really important.
Yeah, and she was also, part of the group that really put San Francisco on the map politically, on the national scene politically, and that was a double-edged sword when she was in leadership. She's so beloved in San Francisco, but of course is this exemplar on the other side of, the limousine liberal and, crazy Nancy or crazy drunk Nancy or however they caricature her.
Drunk on chocolate.
Right. So yeah, I think it's going to be a big shock to San Francisco when she's no longer in there, and somebody will be in her place, but they will have nowhere near the level of clout that she had, or probably the appropriations power that Joe talked about.
Okay, let's talk about some folks who are trying to get those shoes. Joe, you recently moderated a debate with candidates hoping to succeed her. What did you learn about the field from that appearance?
I think each candidate gamed their answers. Shoykat Chakrabarti definitely made it clear to anybody that we need to remake the Democratic Party, and if you want to accomplish the things that liberal San Franciscans want, you need me and a plethora of other people in there to vote the way that Democrats are supposed to vote. Scott Wiener is not a burn it down type of guy. It's like, I can work within this system. I can get things done. Scott's always the stoker in the engine room of wherever he goes. And Connie Chan was appealing to people very locally. I will tell you, as the moderator, I was confused why she brought up Free City College 2 or 3 times. But clearly she's talking about local issues that appeal to people. So you do have 3 ways. We can game it out and figure out, which way it's all going to go. But on many of the issues, there were not distinctions. Everybody here, actually, speaking of Nancy Pelosi, one of the knocks on her, everyone says that congressional members should not be trading stocks or owning stocks, right?
Yeah.
So you have to look for your cleaves of what's different about them, but also you have to look at who can actually do what they say. Being a member of Congress is not just, I will have these views and I will, run into the wall. It's being able to actually, accomplish change and be a member of 500 plus Congress people in a body. So we'll see how the major attacks go. Locally, these are all with both Connie and Scott are known quantities.
Yeah.
Chakrabarti is not. So tell us more about him, any of you.
Well, he is kind of from the Bernie bro mold. I think he worked on Bernie.
He worked for
did.
AOC.
Presidential campaigns.
sorry.
He
And
was
Bernie,
he was the one-time chief of staff to AOC. He has a lot of money. He's a centimillionaire. I think he made a lot of money as an employee at Stripe. So he has the resources to pull a Daniel Lurie and pour tons of his personal money into the campaign and kind of get his face out there, which he really needs to do because absolutely no one knew who he was before this race. And I think his critics would argue that he has not really been involved in civic affairs in San Francisco much, while on the other hand, Scott and Connie Chan are both long-time politicians. So I think he's probably betting that he can, through his Instagram videos, he's kind of doing the Zoran Mamdani, like sort of very social media heavy approach. He's betting that he can get his name out there and build momentum for his campaign and make it through the primary. But, I think one of the knocks on him will be that he, like, what have you done here lately?
Yeah, and he and Connie Chan are for sure running to Scott Wiener's left, which is ironic given how, well, he's portrayed in the national media too. But I think, I'm just really interested to see like how, like we talked about earlier around housing policy. I mean, that's been one of Scott's biggest policy areas. I think just on the merits of what Joe was talking about in terms of like being able to like get into a legislative body and like cut deals and build goodwill and all of those things. I feel like Scott probably has the best resume there. He's been in Sacramento for a long time. He was on the Board of Supervisors. He's passed things, he will not take no for an answer. So he has passed legislation, especially around housing, which we mentioned, that looked like dead on arrival the first time he introduced it and has really gone back. And he, like a lot of our San Francisco legislators, once they get to Sacramento, I mean, I saw this even with, Tom Ammiano, who is to his left, a lot of the folks who have, Mark Leno, there's this sense that there are these like crazy San Francisco liberals. They have good relationships in SAC with a lot of the more moderate Democrats and even Republicans. And I think Scott would be one of those people that you might be surprised as to some of his like personal relationships with folks. I think Chan has only been in elected office for 5 years. But she's certainly a known quantity within like City Hall. She was a staffer. She was an aide to a supervisor. She was staffer at Rec
Multiple
and Park
supervisors, yep.
And where else? Yeah.
Kamala.
Yeah. So, she's the DA's office, right? Man. We're old, Joe. We've been doing this a while. So I think like it seems like at this point, Shoykat Chakrabarti has the hardest road to like beating out one of them into a runoff, but never say never. Politics is nuts. I think a lot of like the typical kind of political fault lines, like I said, could be shuffled slightly in this race because he's going to have like he's on national media all the time. So like if you are a person who like has CNN or MSNBC going, MS1 or whatever they're called, in your house all the time, like you might be familiar with him, but I don't think like your average San Franciscan is going to be able to pick him out of a lineup yet.
Is Pelosi has she
Not yet.
endorsed, will she endorse, do you think?
Probably.
And how powerful do you think that would be for Connie? I'm assuming it would be Connie Chan.
It would help a lot.
But does she want Scott to stay in the state Senate, or would she like Christine Pelosi to get that seat 2 years early in a special election?
When is Wiener?
Not
when
till
would he-
2028.
28.
I mean, I think the election's in 27,
Okay.
right? So Christine Pelosi and Nancy Pelosi, one of her daughters, is running for Scott's Senate seat, either when he's termed out or if he gets elected. So I think it's going to be fascinating. And I don't know if she'll actually like endorse Connie Chan or if she'll kind of like
Just do nothing.
just do
Yeah,
nothing.
we'll see.
Well, I mean, it could also be behind the scenes stuff that she's so excellent at,
Right.
getting the
But
donors her
but for
way
whom?
and machine.
Well, right, because that would be the thing. I think what if Pelosi decides to publicly support Connie Chan, it would less be just the endorsement and more her ability to raise money for Connie that I think would be so potent. Would she, like, it seems to me that if she's making the calculation around the Senate seat, then you wouldn't necessarily do all of that. But I don't know. I mean, this is like pure speculation on my part.
Okay. Annie,
Because we love speculating wildly,
where would we be without it? Annie, Scott Wiener has faced criticism locally over Gaza, and he recently switched gears and said that Israel has committed genocide there. This created a firestorm in some circles. What was he trying to do you think, and what happens next?
I think that was a move that is not going to make anybody happy. You are never going to convince the progressives that he's being sincere, and he, I think a number of Jewish groups and Jewish writers have come out and called it disingenuous or worse.
They're probably not going to abandon him.
No, but I just think it's an awkward look that is going to be perceived, fairly or not, as a opportunistic flip flop that could make voters trust him less.
Yeah, it was messy. I thought it was
It's
sloppy.
messy,
It
yeah.
was not typical Scott. He's a very smart politician, and I thought he should have known that Joe asked that question in a lightning round at that candidate forum last week, and he didn't answer in the moment. There's no reason not to know whether it was that forum or in general that this was going to be an issue, and I feel like he kind of stepped in it.
Yeah, it's not so much the position itself, it's just the perception of a flip-flop. I think that's more of a problem.
Right, and if he had had the agency to decide to address it on his own, it feels like he was very much pushed into it, which makes it easier for both sides to say well, that's disingenuous, as opposed to just sort of reading the tea leaves and knowing that this is not an issue that's going away and that you're going to be pressed on, especially given that you have been a very vocal supporter of the state of Israel.
Joe, you were there at the moment.
Joe asked
What's your take?
Joe got him in the hot one.
Technically,
Joe, you ended Scott Wiener's campaign. How do you think?
technically, Cynthia asked the question, but I think that anybody who makes Israel the number one issue is never going to vote for Scott Wiener. So we'll see how that plays out.
Or on the other side, the other two candidates.
Yeah.
Right, if you're...
Yeah, so I think, with the condemnation coming from the JCRC and others, I don't foresee them abandoning Scott Wiener to vote for people who are emphatic in their criticism of Israel. So we'll see. I don't know that it's going to quote unquote go away, but on the other hand,
Is that the top issue?
I don't know that San Franciscans at this time, even with our relative luck, are going to be able to make this into the referendum on Israel here. So I think the people who really, really, really are into this, and this is their number one overriding issue, they were never going to vote for Scott Wiener.
I think the housing issue is going to be a bigger overlay.
Talk about that a bit.
Overlay.
That was
of
literally
this.
my next question anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I just think that if you're going people who have strong feelings about Scott in particular, I think that's
I think Republicans will vote for Connie Chan because of
Top.
that.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Republicans will vote for Connie Chan because of the housing issue.
which is wild in the sense that when I started reporting in California politics, developer was an evil word on the left, and Republicans were embracing of it. And on paper, a lot of these zoning changes, if you talk to Republicans, it's not that they oppose them; it's that they haven't gone far enough, right? So it's pretty insane that you would vote for a labor progressive sort of but then you also get into when you get into neighborhood politics and NIMBY politics, the normal overlay of political parties is not really that important. It's more how does this affect the shadows in my backyard?
It's very hard to predict what people are going to vote about because we have no idea what the federal government is going to do. And if somebody is going to say policy on Israel is overriding, it's we have no idea what the Trump administration is going to do. And are you so certain that they can't just do whatever the hell they want about sending weapons to wherever the hell they want, whether Congress agrees with it or not? I don't know where we're going there.
Yeah, foreign policy is always over debated and not actually that important in local races, I would argue.
Okay, let's talk briefly. We're running out of time. Crime and drugs. Obviously, San Francisco has been a punching bag across the country on this for years, even though every city, or most cities, had kind of the pandemic rise and then fall. Crime is down dramatically. Public perception doesn't necessarily always reflect that. Annie, what role do you think this is playing in voters' mood these days, as well as any...
What's the view from the East Coast? What are you hearing in your new job?
There hasn't been, as much to beat up on San Francisco about lately. I think that's fair to say. But, I think crime falling has been to some extent a national phenomenon. I think in San Francisco, I wrote just a story a few weeks ago about how Prop E, which was championed by London Breed, which kind of enabled more drones and police surveillance and some kind of things, is kind of at this point bearing some fruit in the crime numbers. But I think a big factor was actually the Supreme Court decision that made it easier to clear tent encampments, because I think that a large part of the perception of disorder and the images of disorder that have been associated with San Francisco over the past few years have been about encampments and just those images and crime and disorder that are associated with that. So I think that was possibly the biggest factor that actually changed perceptions of San Francisco as a hellscape filled with encampments and broken glass everywhere. And again, the mayor has sort of benefited from that trajectory.
Marisa, you've pointed out that District Attorney Brooke Jenkins has kind of been under the radar. How is she doing? What do you think she's facing in her next election?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, for somebody who came in under such sort of controversy with the recall of Chase Subedine and whether she was, sort of qualified or had almost set up the thing so she could run, I think she's done a pretty good job. I mean, she's, in dust-ups all the time with the public defender's office. That's sort of nothing new. But I am not hearing, and I'm not reporting on it daily, but just DA is a hard job. Prosecutors are rarely happy. I haven't heard a lot of sort of grumbling from that office in the way that, quite frankly, I have under almost every previous DA. So that's interesting to me. I also think on the idea of perception and things that are not concrete arrests or whatever, I think the passage of 36 and the national debate around and statewide and local debate around crime has given police a sense that they are more supported than they felt 5 years ago. And I think that makes a difference, because one of the things we saw with 47 and retail theft was just cops who were refusing to respond or to arrest people because they didn't think it was worth their time as a misdemeanor. So I think there's often intangible things related to crime statistics, and to Annie's point, they always rise and fall nationally. They're often worse in certain pockets of, places, cities, counties, but yeah, I think this is certainly an area where some of this is just the natural cycle of things, and COVID was such a weird outlier, so everything, you have to kind of view everything through that.
Joe, you get the final word.
Well, I have lots of thoughts about all this. I mean,
You got a minute.
I'll talk fast. I mean, the number of murders is so low. It was 28. That's astounding. When
really
Marisa and I
is.
were covering things under Gavin Newsom, it was hitting 100.
100, yeah.
So it's so bad that the police actually claimed that somebody who stabbed himself 3 times and then there was no murder weapon left. Actually, he might have thrown it out the window after killing himself, right? Instead of admitting, clearly he was murdered, right? You didn't want, and there were 98 murders that year, right? With regard to the tents, a lot of this is vibes. We've had, campaigning with vibes, and now we're having governing with vibes. The fact of the matter is that London Breed cleared more tents under the injunction that was wiped away by the Supreme Court than before it. So there were always means to clear tents off the streets, and you're not going to believe this, but people in the city didn't think if we take the tents away, people will do antisocial things in public. And watching that in public didn't play well. It's not crime, but it makes people feel terrible to see, and it doesn't feel like a civilized place to be, and makes people feel uneasy, and it doesn't land us more conventions. With Prop E, I think that there's an appetite now for surveillance, and there's, tricky constitutional questions. People don't care about the nuance here. Among other things, we essentially made a billionaire into the de facto equipment supplier for the San Francisco Police Department, and I could see issues with that. But we're very happy to move along as we have, and we have low crime numbers, so who's going to complain? And if you are arguing the counterfactual, you're arguing for criminals, and that makes it very hard these days. Mm-hmm. As for Brooke Jenkins, she unambiguously committed a crime when she sent the rap sheet for the fellow who ran over the 2 women on New Year's Eve to her colleague. Unambiguously committed a crime. It was Rob Bonta chose not to investigate it. She went into a diversion program. So, but I don't see a lot of angry people saying, the DA's office should be run differently. We should handle criminals differently.
Yeah.
So, her next election will be for DA because Rob Bonta is not running for governor.
Yes.
Okay, well, on that note, our thanks to Marisa Lagos, Joe Eskenazi, and Annie Gauss for joining us here today. And for more information about membership or upcoming Commonwealth Club World Affairs programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm John Zipper. Thank you, and have a great day.